His arm trembled violently, muscles screaming in silent agony, as sweat trickled down his forehead beneath the distinctive Renaissance-era helmet. 6 hours. The Swiss guard's face remained expressionless despite the torture. His white-gloved hand locked in a perfect salute beside St. Peter's Basilica, as the Pope's body finally moved past him in solemn procession. Only then did a single tear escape from beneath his stoic gaze. This wasn't just duty. This was devotion of the highest order. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories of extraordinary human endurance and devotion, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. The date was April 8, 2005. The world had come to a standstill just days earlier with the announcement of Pope John Paul II's death. But inside Vatican City, one group of men stepped forward to shoulder a burden few could imagine: the Pontifical Swiss Guard, the oldest standing military unit in continuous operation, dating back to 1506. Among them stood 23-year-old guardsman Marco Brenner, a devout Catholic from a small village near Lucerne, Switzerland. Marco had joined the Swiss Guard just 14 months earlier, driven by both family tradition and personal faith. His grandfather had served as a Swiss Guard under Pope Pius XII, and his father had always spoken of those years with reverence bordering on awe. "You do not merely serve a man," his father had told him. "You serve an office that stretches back to St. Peter himself." That morning began like any other during this period of mourning. Marco rose before dawn, donned his blue, red, and yellow Renaissance-inspired uniform, designed, according to tradition, by Michelangelo himself, and reported for duty at 5 a.m. The atmosphere within the Vatican was thick with sorrow and anticipation. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims had flocked to Rome to pay their respects, forming lines that stretched for miles through the ancient city. What Marco didn't know as he took his position was that this day would test him beyond anything he had prepared for. He had been assigned a post directly along the route where the Pope's body would eventually be transferred from the Sala Clementina, where it had been lying in state for the private viewing of Vatican officials, to St. Peter's Basilica, where the public would be permitted to pay their respects. Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello approached Marco just before taking his position. "Today will be difficult, son," the cardinal said quietly. "The Holy Father's transfer has been delayed several times already. We expect it may be many hours before the procession begins." Marco nodded solemnly. "I am prepared, Your Eminence." The cardinal's eyes softened with something like pity. "Remember, this is not about endurance for its own sake. This is your witness, your testimony." Marco took his position at 6 a.m., standing at perfect attention, his right arm raised in salute. The traditional halberds, combination spear and battle axe, held by other guards, were not part of his equipment today. His only task was to stand, to salute, and to wait. The first hour passed relatively easily. Marco had endured much longer periods of standing at attention during his training. The second hour brought the first whispers of discomfort: a dull ache in his shoulder, the early signs of strain in his lower back. By the third hour, the pain had become a constant companion, radiating from his raised arm through his entire upper body. But it was during the fourth hour that the true test began. Marco's vision began to blur slightly at the edges. His arm trembled visibly now, no matter how much he concentrated on keeping it still. The sweat had soaked through his collar, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. Tourists and pilgrims passed by, many stopping to take photos of the stoic guard, unaware of the battle raging within him. A middle-aged American woman approached, speaking to her husband in a hushed voice that Marco could nonetheless hear clearly. "How long has he been standing there?" she asked. "I saw him when we arrived this morning," her husband replied, checking his watch. "That was almost 5 hours ago." The woman's eyes widened. "Shouldn't someone relieve him?" "I think this is their tradition," her husband said. "It's their way of honoring the Pope." Marco fixed his gaze forward, pretending not to hear, but their words penetrated deeply. Yes, this was tradition, this was honor, but it was becoming something more: a personal crucible, a test of his most fundamental beliefs about duty and faith. As the fifth hour approached, Marco's body began to betray him. His legs wobbled slightly, His raised arm had gone completely numb, and he could no longer feel his fingers. The muscles in his neck and back seized in painful spasms. Twice, he nearly fainted, his vision darkening momentarily before he managed to steady himself. It was then that Captain Christoph Pfiffer von Altschaffen, commander of the Swiss Guard, passed by on an inspection. The captain paused, taking in Marco's condition with experienced eyes. He stepped closer. "Guardsman Brenner," he said quietly, ensuring no visitors could hear. "You are relieved if you require it. There would be no dishonor." Marco swallowed hard, his throat painfully dry. "With respect, Captain, I will remain at my post." The captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Ad merum Dei gloriam," he whispered, "for the greater glory of God," before continuing on his way. Left alone again, Marco began to lose all sense of time. The pain had become so constant that it transformed into something almost separate from himself. He began to reflect, in the strange clarity that sometimes accompanies extreme physical duress, on what had brought him to this moment. He thought of his small childhood home in Switzerland, of sitting on his grandfather's knee listening to stories of the Vatican. He recalled the pride in his parents' eyes when he'd been accepted into the Guard. He remembered his first glimpse of Pope John Paul II in person, the gentle, weathered face that somehow radiated both tremendous suffering and boundless compassion. During his short time of service, Marco had guarded the Pope during several public audiences. He had never spoken directly to the Holy Father, but once the Pope had paused while passing, made eye contact with Marco, and offered him a small, knowing smile. That fleeting connection had affected Marco profoundly, reinforcing his sense that he was serving something greater than himself. As the 6th hour approached, Marco's condition deteriorated further. His uniform was soaked with sweat. Blood had pooled in his lower arm, turning his hand a dark purplish color. His knees locked and unlocked involuntarily. Several times, senior guards passing by gave him concerned glances, but Marco maintained his position. And then, finally, it happened. A hush fell over the crowded basilica. The Swiss Guard drummers began a slow, somber cadence. Cardinal Ratzinger appeared, followed by a procession of priests and bishops. And there, carried on a simple wooden platform draped in red, was the body of Pope John Paul II. The sight sent a surge of something like electricity through Marco's exhausted frame. As the Pope's body drew near, Marco summoned whatever strength remained in his depleted body and stood straighter, held his salute more firmly. Though his vision blurred with tears and exhaustion, he forced himself to focus on the peaceful face of the man he had sworn to protect. A man he could no longer protect, except through this final act of devotion. As the Pope's body passed directly before him, Marco felt something inside him break. Not his resolve, that remained iron, but rather some barrier between the physical and spiritual dimensions of his experience. The pain receded momentarily, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose and connection to the centuries of guards who had stood similarly before him. Only when the procession had completely passed, only when the Pope's body had been situated in its place of honor before the altar of confession, did Captain Pfiffer approach Marco again. "At ease, guardsman," he said quietly. Marco's arm fell to his side like a stone, the sensation both excruciating and blissful. He swayed dangerously, and 2 fellow guards materialized beside him, supporting him discreetly. "Medical attention now," the captain ordered in a whisper. Marco was led away to the guards' quarters, where the unit's physician examined him immediately. The diagnosis was severe: dehydration, muscle damage, and early signs of rhabdomyolysis, a dangerous condition where damaged muscle tissue releases proteins into the blood that can cause kidney failure. "You could have died, young man," the doctor scolded as he inserted an IV into Marco's arm, "or at the very least caused permanent damage." Marco, lying on the examination table, managed a weak smile. "It was worth it, doctor." The doctor shook his head in exasperation but said nothing more. Later that evening, as Marco rested in his bunk, Captain Pfiffer visited him again. The captain sat beside Marco's bed. His usually stern face softened with concern and something else: respect. "What you did today was both foolish and extraordinary," the captain said after a moment of silence. "I only did my duty, sir," Marco replied. "No," the captain responded firmly. "Your duty was to stand guard for your assigned shift. What you did went far beyond duty." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In my 30 years of service, I have never witnessed such a display of devotion." Marco felt a flush of pride, quickly followed by humility. "I kept thinking of something my grandfather once told me. He said that sometimes God asks for more than we think we can give, to show us that with his help, we can give more than we thought possible." The captain nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was a wise man." He stood to leave but turned back at the door. "Rest now, Guardsman Brenner. The Holy Father's funeral is in 3 days, and your presence will be required." "I'll be ready, sir," Marco promised. The morning of Pope John Paul II's funeral dawned clear and cool. An estimated 4 million mourners had descended upon Rome, along with nearly 200 world leaders and dignitaries, the largest gathering of heads of state in history outside the United Nations. Marco, still recovering but insistent on participating, joined his fellow guards in providing security for the momentous event. His arm was tightly wrapped, and the doctor had strongly advised against any strenuous activity. But Marco stood his post with the same unwavering commitment he had shown days earlier. As the funeral mass concluded and the Pope's simple cypress coffin was carried back into St. Peter's Basilica for entombment, something remarkable happened. The crowd of millions spontaneously erupted in applause, a tradition for distinguished Italians that continued for nearly 15 minutes. And there, along with the cardinals, world leaders, and countless mourners, Marco found himself weeping openly, not from physical pain this time, but from the overwhelming realization that he had been part of something historic, something transcendent. In the days that followed, word of Marco's 6-hour salute spread throughout the Vatican and beyond. Cardinal Bertello mentioned it during a meeting of the College of Cardinals. Journalists caught wind of the story and sought interviews, which Marco politely but firmly declined. To him, what he had done was personal, not performative. 2 weeks later, as the cardinals gathered in conclave to elect a new pope, Marco resumed his regular duties. His arm had mostly healed, though the doctors warned he might experience chronic pain and reduced mobility. He was a price Marco accepted without complaint. On April 19th, white smoke billowed from the Sistine Chapel chimney, signaling the election of Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger as Pope Benedict XVI. As the new pope gave his first blessing to the crowd in St. Peter's Square, Marco stood at attention nearby, his face composed but his heart full. After the ceremony, as Pope Benedict was returning to his quarters, he paused before Marco. To the young guard's astonishment, the Pope extended his hand. "Guardsman Brenner," the Pope said, his German accent distinct but his Italian impeccable. "Cardinal Bertello told me of your vigil for my predecessor. Such faith does not go unnoticed, neither by men nor by God." Marco, overwhelmed, could only bow his head in gratitude. That night, alone in the small chapel reserved for the Swiss Guard, Marco knelt in prayer. His shoulder ached. It would always ache, the doctor had told him, but the pain now carried a different meaning. It had become a reminder, not of suffering, but of the depth of his commitment. Years later, long after his service in the Swiss Guard had ended, Marco would tell his own children about that day, not boastfully, but as a lesson in what it means to give oneself completely to something one believes in. It wasn't about physical endurance, he would explain. It was about bearing witness. In that moment, standing there despite the pain, I understood something essential about faith. It isn't always comfortable. It isn't always easy. Sometimes it asks everything of you. But in giving everything, you receive something greater in return. The story of the Swiss Guard who held his salute for 6 hours until Pope John Paul II's body was taken away would become one small but significant part of the larger tapestry of devotion that has sustained the Catholic Church for 2 millennia. In the grand history of the Vatican, it was perhaps just a footnote, but footnotes, too, can reveal profound truths. For Marco Brenner, that day of physical agony and spiritual transcendence would remain the defining moment of his life, not because of any recognition he received, but because for 6 grueling hours, he had found the limit of his physical strength and then, through faith, pushed beyond it. In that simple act of standing, of refusing to yield despite every instinct of self-preservation, he had discovered what generations of the faithful before him had also learned: that sometimes the most profound expressions of devotion are not grand gestures or eloquent words, but simply the quiet determination to remain steadfast when every fiber of your being cries out for relief. And perhaps that, in the end, is the most enduring lesson of the Swiss Guard's vigil: that true devotion is measured not in moments of ease, but in hours of endurance, when standing firm becomes an act of both devastating cost and immeasurable worth.